before the torch ever illuminated the faces of those left behind, before the conquerors claimed their spoils, the wives of fallen warriors already knew their fate. Victory celebrated heroes, but defeat brought something far darker. In the shadowed centuries we call the Dark Ages, when kingdoms rose and fell with the swing of a sword, women bore the unseen cost of every battlefield loss. Their suffering was not accidental. It was deliberate, calculated, woven into the very fabric of conquest. If you're drawn to the hidden truths of history, where the innocent are crushed beneath the weight of war, subscribe. This is not folklore. This is the systematic breaking of women whose only crime was loving men who fought and lost. Comment where you're watching from and stay with me, because the battlefield was never the end of war. What happened afterward, in the quiet spaces where history rarely looks, was far more devastating. In the brutal arithmetic of medieval warfare, a defeated warrior's wife held a strange and terrible value. She was not simply collateral damage. She was currency, symbol, and victim all at once. When the fighting stopped and the screaming began, these women discovered that their husbands' deaths were only the opening act of their own tragedy. The Dark Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 10th century across Europe and beyond, were defined by constant conflict. Kingdoms fragmented and reformed like breaking waves. Tribal confederations clashed over territory, honor, and survival itself. And in this endless cycle of violence, certain rules emerged, unwritten but universally understood. The vanquished would be punished, and that punishment would extend far beyond the warriors who fell. The wife of a defeated warrior occupied a peculiar position in this merciless hierarchy. She represented the conquered people, embodied their shame, and offered victors a living canvas upon which to paint their dominance. Her body became a battlefield after the battle ended. Her dignity became negotiable. Her future disappeared the moment her husband's sword fell from his dying hand. This was not isolated cruelty. This was system, tradition, the way things were done when might made right and compassion was considered weakness. The moment a fortress fell or a shield wall broke, the real terror began for the women inside. Warriors knew death might find them on the field. Their wives knew something potentially worse awaited them in its aftermath. They huddled in great halls and modest huts, listening to the sounds of defeat drawing closer. The clash of steel fading into victorious roars. The heavy footsteps approaching, the doors splintering open, and then the grabbing hands, the rough voices, the realization that they had become property of men who viewed them as prizes won through violence. Across the forests of Germania, the hills of Britain, the steppes of the East, and the fractured remnants of the Roman Empire, the pattern repeated with grim consistency. When Saxons defeated Britons, when Vikings raided coastal settlements, when Frankish armies crushed their enemies, the treatment of defeated warriors' wives followed predictable, horrifying paths. These women faced enslavement, forced marriage, public humiliation, sexual violence, separation from their children, and the complete erasure of their former identities. The specific methods varied by culture and region, but the underlying logic remained constant. Breaking the women of defeated warriors was how victors demonstrated total conquest. Some were marched away in chains, torn from everything they knew, to be sold in distant markets where their origins meant nothing and their protests meant less. Others found themselves thrust into the beds of the very men who had killed their husbands, forced to bear the children of their enemies, to serve in households built on the ashes of their former lives. Still others faced public degradation designed to shame not just them, but the entire defeated people they represented. Their hair was shorn, their faces were marked, their bodies were displayed as living monuments to their husband's failure. The psychological warfare was as calculated as any battlefield strategy. By degrading these women, victors sent a message that echoed through generations. Your warriors could not protect you. Your gods abandoned you. Your way of life is finished. Every humiliated wife became proof of conquest, walking evidence that the old order had crumbled and something new, Something merciless had taken its place. And for the women themselves, survival required a kind of death. The death of who they had been. The death of hope. The acceptance that the world they knew had ended and they must navigate the ruins. Let's walk through those ruins. Let us look closely at what happened when the fighting stopped and the real horror began. Let us remember the women whose names history never recorded, whose suffering was considered too common to document, whose screams faded into the background noise of an age that traded in human misery as readily as it traded in steel and grain. The first blow often came before the victor's blade was even cleaned. As the last defenders fell and resistance crumbled, the wives of warriors faced immediate danger from the surging tide of conquerors. Historical accounts from various chronicles describe scenes that repeat across different conflicts. The breaking down of doors, the searching of rooms, the desperate attempts to hide that almost never succeeded. Women of status, the wives of chieftains and nobles, sometimes believed their rank might protect them. They learned quickly that defeat had stripped them of all privilege. A Thane's wife in Anglo-Saxon England, a Jarl's wife in Scandinavia, a Cum's wife in Frankish territory, all discovered that their former positions meant nothing to victors who viewed them as symbols to be broken. The initial hours after defeat were perhaps the most chaotic and dangerous. Discipline among conquering forces varied wildly. Some commanders maintained strict control, reserving captured women for systematic distribution or ransom. Others allowed their men free rein, turning the immediate aftermath into a nightmare of unchecked violence. The writings of monks and chroniclers, though often vague about specifics, make clear that sexual assault was not an unfortunate side effect of warfare, but an expected component. The violation of defeated warriors' wives served multiple purposes. It satisfied the basest impulses of victorious soldiers. It demonstrated total domination. It potentially produced children who would blur the lines between conqueror and conquered. And it inflicted psychological wounds that would never fully heal. For women of the warrior class, this represented a catastrophic inversion of their world. They had grown up in societies that prized martial valor and male protection. Their identities were bound up in being wives of defenders, mothers of future warriors. The central promise of their social order was that strong men would keep them safe. Defeat shattered that promise completely. The very thing that defined their status, their connection to warriors, became the source of their persecution. They were targeted not despite being warriors' wives, but precisely because they were warriors' wives. Enslavement represented one of the most common fates for these women. The slave trade thrived throughout the Dark Ages, fueled by constant warfare and the steady supply of defeated populations. Women captured after battle represented valuable commodities. They could be worked, bred, sold, and resold. Their labor enriched their captors. Their bodies produced the next generation of slaves. Their presence in a household signaled the owner's success in war or wealth in trade. A warrior's wife from a defeated tribe might find herself carried hundreds of miles from home, unable to speak the language of her new masters, cut off from any possibility of rescue or return. The slave markets of the era operated with brutal efficiency. Major trading centers like Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, and various ports along the Mediterranean and Black Sea coast saw regular auctions where human beings were evaluated and purchased like livestock. Chroniclers mention that women from certain regions or with certain skills commanded higher prices. A Saxon woman who could weave, an Irish woman known for her beauty, a Slavic woman young enough to bear many children, each had different value in the cold calculations of the slave trade. But regardless of their individual worth, all shared the fundamental trauma of being reduced to property, stripped of personhood, and sold to strangers who cared nothing for who they had been. Life as a slave varied depending on the household and the temperament of the master, but certain realities remained constant. The work was endless and exhausting. The threat of violence hung over every moment. Sexual exploitation was common and considered entirely within the master's rights. Resistance brought harsh punishment. Escape attempts, if discovered, resulted in brutal reprisals. And perhaps most painfully, there was no end in sight. Unlike prisoners of war who might be ransomed, slaves could expect to remain in bondage until death, their children born into the same status, generation after generation. Some warriors' wives endured a different, but equally traumatic fate: forced marriage to their captors. This practice had ancient roots and served several functions for conquering peoples. It bound defeated populations to their conquerors through kinship. It legitimized the taking of land and property. It produced heirs who could claim rights through both victor and vanquished lines. And it offered victorious warriors a veneer of respectability for what was essentially legalized abduction and rape. The woman who had been a wife became a wife again, but under circumstances that mocked the very concept of marriage. These forced unions followed patterns shaped by both practicality and symbolism. A victorious chieftain might claim the wife of the defeated leader, making her his own to demonstrate his complete triumph. Lower-ranking warriors would receive or purchase the wives of defeated enemies, absorbing them into households where they would serve as both laborers and bed partners. The ceremonies surrounding such marriages, when any ceremony occurred at all, were often perfunctory. The woman's consent was neither requested nor required. She was told her new role and expected to accept it or face consequences that ranged from beating to death. For these women, the psychological torment was multi-layered. They were forced to share the bed of men who might have personally killed their husbands. They were expected to bear children for the bloodline that had destroyed their own families. They lived in communities that viewed them with suspicion, never quite trusted, never quite accepted. Their grief had to be hidden. Their rage had to be swallowed. Survival required them to become complicit in their own erasure, to mother the children of their enemies, to gradually forget or pretend to forget who they had been. The children born from such unions occupied a strange middle ground. They were living embodiments of conquest, neither fully accepted by the conquered people from whom their mothers came, nor entirely equal to the children of freeborn women in their Father society. Some cultures integrated them relatively quickly, viewing conquest and assimilation as natural processes. Others maintained distinctions that could last generations, with the maternal line marking certain children as lesser despite their warrior fathers. For the mothers themselves, these children represented both profound love and profound pain. They were innocents deserving protection, but also constant reminders of violence and loss. Public humiliation served as another tool in the arsenal of conquest. When victors wanted to send unmistakable messages about power dynamics, they staged degrading spectacles featuring the wives and daughters of defeated warriors. These demonstrations varied in form, but shared common elements. They were performed before audiences. They stripped away dignity. They marked the victims as conquered and inferior. And they were remembered, passed down through oral tradition as warnings about the costs of resistance and defeat. Hair cutting represented one of the most common forms of this public shaming. In many Dark Age cultures, a woman's hair carried deep symbolic significance. It represented her femininity, her status, her connection to her family and community. Long, well-maintained hair marked respectable women. To shave or roughly hack off a defeated warrior's wife's hair was to symbolically unmake her, to strip away the markers of her former identity. This practice appears in accounts from Anglo-Saxon England, where defeated noble women had their hair cut short. Among Germanic tribes, where similar customs prevailed. In Celtic societies, where women's hair held ritual and social meaning. The act was designed to shame, to make visible what defeat had done to these women. Beyond hair, other forms of marking and mutilation occurred with disturbing regularity. Some societies branded captured women, literally burning ownership marks into their skin. Others tattooed them, creating permanent, visible signs of their defeated status. Facial scarring appeared in some accounts, strategic cuts designed to mar beauty and mark shame without rendering the woman unable to work. These markings serve practical purposes, making it harder for women to escape and easier to identify them as belonging to specific owners or conquered groups. But they also served psychological functions, forcing the marked women to carry their defeat with them always, visible in every reflection, noticed in every interaction. Forced labor under degrading conditions represented another dimension of punishment. Warriors' wives who had perhaps never performed the hardest physical tasks in their former lives found themselves assigned the most grueling and demeaning work. Hauling water, cleaning waste, working fields from dawn until collapse, these became the new reality. The work itself was punishment, but so was the reversal it represented. Women who had directed servants now served those who directed them with cruelty and contempt. The physical exhaustion was relentless, but the psychological burden of such complete reversal perhaps weighed even heavier. Separation from children inflicted wounds that never healed. Conquerors understood that the bond between mother and child represented one of the strongest human connections, and they exploited this knowledge without mercy. Children were valuable as future laborers and slaves. They could be sold separately from their mothers, maximizing profit. They could be absorbed into the victor's culture, raised to forget their origins and serve their former enemies. And their removal from their mother's arms served as a powerful tool of control and punishment. The scenes of separation haunted those who witnessed them. Mothers clinging to small children as they were torn away. The desperate screams. The small hands reaching back. The way some women simply broke, collapsing into silence or madness after their children disappeared. Some mothers never learned what became of their sons and daughters. They died not knowing whether their children lived or died, prospered or suffered. The not knowing became its own torture, the imagination filling in gaps with scenarios that range from hope to horror. The boys, especially sons of warriors, faced specific fates. Some were enslaved outright, put to work as any other unfree person might be. Others were raised as servants or lower-class members of the conquering society, trained to forget their heritage and serve the people who had defeated their fathers. In some cases, young boys were castrated, made into eunuchs for service in households where their inability to produce heirs made them seem less threatening. This particularly cruel practice appears in accounts from various regions, representing the ultimate denial of continuity. These boys would never become warriors like their fathers. They would never father the next generation of resistance. The daughters faced different but equally grim prospects. Pretty girls might be kept for eventual forced marriage or concubinage. Others were trained as servants and slaves. Some were sold far from home while still children, disappearing into distant households where their origins meant nothing. The practice of separating mothers and daughters sometimes followed calculated logic. A daughter raised apart from her mother would not learn the old stories, the old ways, the old hatreds. She would be easier to assimilate, less likely to resist, more fully conquered in mind as well as body. Religious conversion represented another weapon deployed against defeated peoples, with warriors' wives often specifically targeted. The spread of Christianity across pagan Europe occurred not just through peaceful persuasion, but through conquest and coercion. When Christian kings defeated pagan tribes, forced baptism of the defeated followed with predictable regularity. Warriors' wives found themselves dragged to rivers and fonts, held underwater while foreign priests spoke incomprehensible words, then declared Christian whether they understood or accepted the faith or not. This religious violation carried particular weight in societies where women often served as preservers of traditional spiritual practices. The wife of a warrior might have been a keeper of household shrines, a teacher of old prayers, a link to ancestral ways of honoring the gods. Forced conversion attempted to sever that link, to make her complicit in abandoning the beliefs that had structured her understanding of the world. Some resisted openly and paid with their lives. Others outwardly complied, while secretly maintaining old practices, creating the seeds of the folk traditions that would persist for centuries. Still others, especially those captured young, genuinely converted, their old beliefs fading under the weight of constant pressure and indoctrination. The converse also occurred. When pagan conquerors defeated Christian communities, forcing the wives of Christian warriors to participate in pagan rituals, to serve in temples they considered demonic, to perform acts their faith condemned as abomination. For women whose Christian identity formed the core of their understanding of themselves and the world, this represented a spiritual death alongside the physical and social death of their former lives. The forced participation in what they believed to be damnation became its own unique torture. Time passed differently for these women. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. The acute horror of the initial defeat gradually gave way to the grinding reality of their new existence. Some found ways to survive psychologically. They built new connections with other captured women, forming bonds of shared suffering. They found small moments of comfort or rebellion. They held secret memories of their former lives like precious treasures, taken out in private moments and carefully hidden away again. They survived by becoming smaller, quieter, less visible, less themselves. Others could not or would not adapt. They remained frozen in their trauma, unable to accept what had happened, unable to move forward. These women often did not survive long. Depression and despair manifested in physical illness, refusal to eat, vulnerability to disease. Some took their own lives, choosing death over continued degradation. The chronicles occasionally mention such suicides, usually in passing, as unremarkable facts about defeated peoples. A woman who threw herself from a cliff. A woman who hanged herself in a storage room. A woman who walked into a river and did not come back. Their names were not recorded. Their reasons were not explored. They were simply noted as casualties of conquest. The rare stories of resistance and revenge that survive in the historical record hint at how many more such stories must have been lost. A woman who poisoned her captor. A woman who escaped and made it back to her people. A woman who killed the master who raped her and accepted her own death as consequence. These fragments suggest that not all defeated warriors' wives accepted their fate passively. Some fought back in the ways available to them. But the very rarity of these stories in surviving sources tells its own tale. Most resistance was either crushed immediately or never considered worth recording. Children born in captivity represented the most complex legacy of these brutal practices. A generation raised between worlds, they carried both conquered and conqueror blood. Their mothers' whispered stories competed with their fathers' proud histories. Some identified fully with their father's people, rejecting any connection to their mother's origins. Others felt torn, never quite belonging to either world. And some, perhaps knowing their mother's suffering, harbored quiet resentments that could flare into violence when opportunity arose. The cycles of conquest and revenge fed on such complications, each generation producing new reasons for old hatreds to continue. The long-term demographic effects of these practices reshaped entire populations. When waves of conquest swept across regions, carrying away the wives and daughters of defeated warriors, they left behind communities with distorted gender ratios and broken family structures. The surviving men faced the choice of remaining alone or seeking wives from other communities, further fracturing old tribal identities. The mixing of populations through forced marriage and enslavement created the ethnic complexities that would define medieval Europe, though this mixing came not through peaceful interchange, but through systematic violence. Some kingdoms and peoples gained reputations for particular cruelty in their treatment of defeated women. The Vikings, in their raids across Britain, Ireland, and the continent, became infamous for carrying away captives, particularly women. Chroniclers and monasteries described the terror of Norse longships appearing on the horizon and the desperate attempts to hide women and children before the raiders struck. The practice was so common that specific terms emerged in Old Norse for different categories of captured women, each denoting their status and use in Norse society. The Magyar raids into Central Europe brought similar horror. The steppe warriors swept through settled lands, carrying away plunder and people. Women captured in these raids might find themselves transported across vast distances to the Hungarian plain, absorbed into a culture utterly foreign to their origins. The sudden violent disconnection from everything known, the inability to speak the language of their captors, the strange customs and harsh landscape, all combined to create a profound sense of unreality and loss. The expansion of Islamic empires into Christian territories and vice versa added religious dimensions to already brutal practices. When Muslim armies defeated Christian forces, the wives of Christian warriors faced specific fates dictated by Islamic law regarding captives. They might be taken as concubines, married to Muslim men, enslaved, or held for ransom. When Christian crusaders defeated Muslim forces, similar patterns played out in reverse, though the specific legal frameworks differed. In both cases, the women themselves had little say in their disposition. Legal frameworks of the era reflected and reinforced these practices. Various law codes from Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, and other peoples included provisions regarding captives and slaves. Some set prices for different categories of captured women. Others outlined the rights masters held over enslaved people, which were extensive and included sexual access. Still others described the process by which free women could be reduced to slavery, which often involved their husband's defeat in battle or their people's conquest. These laws were not seen as unjust or cruel by those who wrote them. They were simply the codification of how the world worked. The Church's response to these practices was complex and often contradictory. Christian theology taught the fundamental equality of all souls before God, which should have argued against slavery and forced marriage. Yet the medieval Church existed within and depended upon societies that practiced both extensively. Church authorities condemned the most extreme brutalities while accepting the basic framework of conquest and slavery. They urged masters to treat slaves with basic humanity while not questioning the institution itself. They blessed marriages that began with abduction and rape, accepting them as valid once certain formalities were observed. Some churchmen went further, arguing that conquest and forced conversion served God's purposes, spreading Christianity even through violent means. Others showed more compassion, establishing religious houses that served as sanctuaries for women fleeing violence. Though such refuges remained rare and could themselves be vulnerable to attack. The voices of women within the Church, nuns and abbesses who might have spoken from personal understanding, remain largely silent in the historical record, their perspectives either unrecorded or lost to time. Gradual changes occurred as the Dark Ages gave way to the High Middle Ages. Stronger centralized kingdoms brought more consistent law enforcement. The Church gained institutional power and pushed, however inconsistently, for reforms. Changing economic conditions made certain forms of slavery less profitable. The status of warriors' wives did not transform overnight, but the total vulnerability they had faced in the immediate aftermath of defeat slowly began to be hedged with limitations and protections, at least in theory. The concept of chivalry, emerging in the later medieval period, included idealized notions of protecting women and treating noble captives with honor. These ideals bore little resemblance to the reality of earlier centuries, and even in their own time, were often honored more in the breach than the observance. But they represented a shift in how at least some people thought conquest should work, a move away from the total warfare that had characterized the Dark Ages. Ransom systems became more formalized, particularly for high-status captives. A defeated noble's wife might be held for ransom rather than enslaved or forced into marriage, provided her family could pay. This created a class distinction in the fate of defeated warriors' wives. Those whose families had wealth and surviving members to negotiate for them stood some chance of eventual release. The wives of common warriors faced no such possibility. Their families, if any survived, lacked the means to redeem them. They remained in whatever situation conquest had placed them. The slow development of more structured warfare, with acknowledged rules about treatment of captives, represented another shift. Various peace movements tried to limit warfare's scope and protect certain categories of people. The Peace of God and Truce of God movements in medieval Europe attempted to establish that some people, including women not bearing arms, should be exempt from violence. These movements had limited success and were frequently ignored, but they planted seeds that would eventually grow into more developed concepts of war crimes and protected persons. Yet even as conditions slowly improved in some regions and some periods, the fundamental patterns established in the Dark Ages left lasting marks. The normalization of violence against defeated populations, the treatment of women as property and prizes, the acceptance of rape as a consequence of conquest, these attitudes persisted long after the specific practices began to decline. They appear and reappear throughout history, wherever warfare destabilizes societies and allows the powerful to act without restraint. The women themselves, the actual individuals who suffered these fates, left almost no direct testimony. They could not write their own accounts. Their stories were told, when they were told at all, by others, usually men, usually those who saw them as objects rather than subjects of history. We catch glimpses in chronicles that mention captives in passing, in legal codes that set their prices, in archaeological evidence that hints at violence and displacement, in folk tales that preserved distorted echoes of real suffering. But their voices, their own words about what they endured, are almost entirely lost. This silence itself becomes part of the story. The erasure of these women's experiences from the historical record reflects their erasure in life. They were made into things, into property, into symbols, stripped of the personhood that would have made their testimony worth recording. Later ages, uncomfortable with the brutality of their ancestors, sometimes looked back on the Dark Ages as primitive and barbaric, a time before civilization's moderating influence. But the practices that defined how defeated warriors' wives were treated did not emerge from simple primitiveness. They emerged from calculated strategies of conquest, from the systematic use of sexual violence and humiliation as weapons of war. Understanding this history requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about how warfare has functioned throughout human history and in many places continues to function. The wives of defeated warriors in the Dark Ages experienced fates that women in war zones continue to experience today. The specific methods may vary, but the underlying pattern remains recognizable. When armed conflict destroys social structures that normally protect the vulnerable, when one group's total defeat by another creates conditions where normal restraints collapse, women connected to defeated men become targets for violence that combines punishment, entertainment, assertion of dominance, and the production of the next generation of conquered people. The long view of history shows gradual progress in establishing norms and laws intended to protect civilians in warfare, including women. The development of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and modern concepts of war crimes represent attempts to limit the kind of brutality that was commonplace in the Dark Ages. Yet the continued prevalence of sexual violence in contemporary conflicts suggests that the fundamental impulses and strategic calculations that led to the systematic punishment of defeated warriors' wives have not been eliminated, merely constrained by frameworks that remain fragile and often unenforced. Remembering these women requires imagining across vast distances of time and culture. We must picture the individual moments of their suffering. The instant when the door crashed open and armed strangers burst through. The rough hands grabbing arms. The sound of a child screaming in the next room. The long march in chains through unfamiliar territory. The first night in a strange household, understanding that this was now life. The years stretching ahead with no hope of change. The slow accommodation to horror. The small resistances and the large despairs. The eventual death, often unrecorded and unremarked, of women whose stories deserve to be remembered, but whose names we will never know. They were mothers like any mothers, who sang to their children and worried about their futures. They were wives like any wives, who had loved or at least lived alongside their husbands, shared their beds and hopes. They were daughters who had themselves been children, playing and learning, imagining futures that would never arrive. They were human beings with the same capacity for joy and suffering, for courage and fear, for love and grief, as any human being in any age. But they lived in a time and circumstances that treated them as less than human, as property to be distributed, bodies to be used, symbols to be degraded. The Dark Ages earned their name partly because they were dark times for those who lived through them, particularly for those on the losing side of the constant conflicts that defined the era. The wives of defeated warriors experienced that darkness in its most concentrated form. They bore in their bodies and spirits the weight of their husbands' failures, their people's weaknesses, their god's abandonment or defeat. They became living sacrifices to the brutal logic of conquest that demanded not just victory, but total domination. Not just the death of enemy warriors, but the breaking of everything those warriors had fought to protect. The centuries eventually moved on. The Dark Ages gave way to the High Middle Ages, then the Renaissance, then modernity. New empires rose and fell. New wars were fought under different banners with different weapons. But for the individual women who lived through that earlier age of iron and blood, trapped in the immediate aftermath of their husbands' defeats, there was no moving on. There was only survival or death, accommodation or resistance, the slow grinding away of hope under the weight of days that offered no relief. Their stories, fragmentary and incomplete as they reach us, demand remembering. Not because the past can be changed or because their suffering can be retroactively relieved, but because forgetting compounds the injustice. To ignore their fate is to participate in the erasure that was done to them, to treat them as the property and objects their captors made them into rather than as the fully human individuals they were. To remember them is to insist that their suffering mattered, that what was done to them was wrong, and that the long arc of history must bend toward never repeating such systematic cruelty. The defeated warriors themselves, the men who fell on battlefield from Britain to the Balkans, at least received the ending they had trained for, the culmination of the lives they had chosen. Many probably died, believing they had protected their families, their last thoughts a hope that their wives and children would be cared for, or at least left in peace. Most died not knowing the reality that awaited those they left behind. Perhaps that was mercy of sort. The wives had no such mercy. They lived on to experience the full consequences of defeat, to bear the weight their husbands could not bear because death had released them from bearing it. In the final reckoning, the punishment of defeated warriors' wives in the Dark Ages stands as one of history's great horrors, made worse by how systematic, how accepted, how unremarkable it was in its own time. These were not unfortunate excesses or isolated incidents, but standard operating procedure across cultures and centuries. The very ordinariness of such cruelty perhaps disturbs us most. This was how things were done. This was the price of defeat, and the women paid it again and again, generation after generation, their names forgotten, their stories untold, their humanity denied. But they existed. They suffered. They endured. And in remembering them now, however imperfectly, however belatedly, we offer the only tribute we can. We say that they mattered, that what happened to them was wrong, that their suffering deserves to be known even if it can never be undone. We refuse to let the darkness of those ages be complete. We insist that somewhere in the historical record, amid all the tales of warriors and battles, of kings and conquests, there is space for the memory of the women who bore the real cost of all that violence. Their story is not uplifting. It offers no redemption, no triumph of spirit, no moment when justice finally arrives. It is simply the truth about what happened when war did what war does when nothing restrains it. And that truth, uncomfortable as it is, remains worth telling. Because only by understanding what humans have done to each other in the past can we hope to prevent its repetition in the future. Only by remembering the women punished for the crime of being married to defeated warriors can we fully grasp the human cost of the violence we sometimes celebrate or romanticize when we tell stories of the Dark Ages. They deserve to be remembered, not as symbols or statistics, but as individuals who lived and suffered and somehow, impossibly, survived. Their resilience in the face of such cruelty stands as testimony to the human capacity to endure even the unbearable. And their fate stands as warning about what happens when that endurance is demanded, when survival requires accepting the unacceptable, when entire categories of people are reduced to things to be done to rather than individuals with inherent dignity and rights. The Dark Ages ended, but for the women who lived through them as defeated warriors' wives, the darkness never truly lifted. It remained with them until their final breath, a shadow that no amount of time or distance could dispel. In remembering them now, we acknowledge that shadow. We refuse to let it be forgotten. And we commit ourselves to ensuring that the darkness they endured never falls so completely over any group of people again. If this history moved you, if these forgotten voices spoke to you across the centuries, support the channel by subscribing and liking. The women who suffered these fates have been erased from history for too long. Share your thoughts about their stories in the comments. The Dark Ages were dark for many reasons, but perhaps darkest of all for those who survived them, bearing scars that history chose not to record.